in the quiet folds of historical past, nestled between the crumbling remnants of the Roman Empire and the early murmurs of the Renaissance. There existed a protracted, and as an alternative, uneventful interval, usually known as the center a long time. It used to be a time not totally devoid of innovation, but one characterized more by way of its sluggish rhythms, enduring customs, and a soft resistance to surprising alternate its inside. This context that one must consider the topic of cleanliness, no longer dramatic cleanliness, not innovative cleanliness, however the sluggish, almost always omitted, unhurried cleanliness of daily life, the variety that used to be neither exalted nor universally disregarded, but as a substitute, woven gently into the fabric of survival. To start with, it's important to comprehend that cleanliness within the core, a long time, was no longer defined by way of the sharp necessities of modernity. There were no antibacterial soaps, no brightly packaged shampoos, no sterile wipes sealed in plastic. There used to be no jogging hot water to be had on demand, nor scented candles to accompany bath time rituals. Alternatively, there existed a quiet mixture of customized tradition and necessity. Humans didn't stay dirty, as is regularly urged, nor did they sparkle with the sheen of ultra-modern hygiene. As a substitute, they existed in an area between, where cleanliness was once relative, functional, and steady. Rivers, for example, played a modest but regular position in the lives of those dwelling for the duration of this long stretch of history. In many small settlements, and even in cities of average size, the local move or flowing water source would serve a twin function as a region for washing and as a supply of water for other tasks. Bathing in such locations was once not, as it is commonly portrayed, a communal social gathering or a dramatic plunge into icy currents. It used to be in general mundane, quiet, and carried out for necessity instead than pleasure. There used to be little spectacle in such acts. Rather, it was a methodical part of living. Certainly, in warmer months, when water did not chill the bones, inside the residence, if the loved ones used to be of some standing, a wooden bathtub possibly used for washing. These tubs, typically crafted from all-writer beech, can be filled laboriously by hand. Water had to be fetched, heated over a fireplace slowly, patiently, after which carried to the tub, customarily requiring a number of journeys. A single bathtub may be utilized by more than one members of the loved ones in succession, beginning with the top of the family and descending in rank. It was once now not a glamorous approach. However, it was once a practical one. Soap, too, did exist. It was not smooth, aromatic, or packaged, but it surely was once cleaning soap nevertheless. A fashioned type used to be lye soap, produced from animal fat mixed with wooden ash and water. The resulting substance would cleanse the body, or clothes, although it was often harsh on the epidermis and had an smell that did not lend itself to luxury. In some regions, specifically those influenced by Arabic traditions, akin to components of southern Europe, more sophisticated soaps had been known, made with olive oil and possessing somewhat gentler houses. But these weren't universally available and remained largely regional. Apparel, for its part, was an additional avenue by means of which medieval individuals approached cleanliness. It was not washed after each use, nor even weekly in lots of circumstances, but there have been ways for clean and cleaning it. Garments perhaps brushed to put off surface grime, aired out to rid them of odors, and, from time to time, soaked in lye water or a different cleansing solution. Linen undergarments, worn close to the epidermis, were extra generally cleaned. This follow, even as much less typically stated, shaped a core aspect of maintaining bodily cleanliness, changing and washing the inner layers instead than the outer. Hair care used to be similarly slow-paced and useful. Combs made out of bone or wood had been used to detangle and dispose of debris. These combs, some of which survive in archaeological records, have been mainly double-sided and carried on one's man or woman. Hair was washed infrequently. However, when it used to be, simple rinses of water, sometimes infused with herbs like rosemary or sage, could be used. Oil or grease probably utilized in a while to manage texture and add a small measure of security. Public bathhouses, where they existed, served an exact and structured reason. Although more normal in bigger cities and particularly prominent in Islamic and Byzantine areas, these areas supplied scheduled possibilities for more thorough bathing. Nonetheless, their use declined over the centuries. Specifically, in Western Europe, because of various social, devout, and well-being related considerations. Still, the place they remained, the experience used to be slow, methodical, and more often than not communal. Though modest in its arrangements, devout associations too had a role to play. Monasteries, indistinct, maintained a set of routines tied no longer just to health, however, to non-secular self-discipline. Monks would wash their palms and commonly maintain orderly grooming and easy their garb in structured intervals. These routines, preserved in monastic rules and manuals, reveal a rhythm of existence that was once no longer hurried, but steady. Cleanliness was now not pursued for self-importance or innovation, however, as a part of a greater program of order. It should also be noted that the climate and seasons governed so much of what might be carried out. In the less warm months, washing of the body may be decreased to ingredients, the palms, the face, the toes, as a substitute, then the whole. Basins have been used for such functions, full of water that had been warmed gently near the fireside. These were not dramatic scenes, but quiet ones, enacted on the commencing or end of the day. Accordingly, cleanliness in the Center Ages was once not a grand event. It was once no longer marketed, celebrated, or excessively decorated. It used to be an assignment, a typical, ordinarily exclusive act, undertaken in quiet moments between the labor of fields, the ringing of church bells, and the training of modest meals. It existed now not as a goal, however, as a person who was once understood and permitted within the context of its time. This is the commencing of our exploration into the routines, the instruments, and the smooth, rhythmic habits that stored medieval persons smooth, no longer pristine, now not sterile, but clean, in their possessed method, and on their own terms. As we drift deeper into this subject, we will uncover the spaces, the rituals, and the lengthy forgotten ways that formed their world, now not unexpectedly, but steadily, as one would become aware of a fog lifting gently over a quiet area. As we transfer progressively into the deeper small print of medieval cleanliness, it turns into fundamental to observe the primary medium by way of which most forms of washing and common hygiene have been practiced. Water. This substance, so common in the modern day with its ease of entry and controlled provide, held a very different character in the course of the Center Ages. It was once not summoned through the flip of a handle, nor controlled by using temperature settings or stress valves. As an alternative, it was approached with care, effort, and, at times, uncertainty. The majority of settlements, each rural and concrete, were centered in proximity to usual water sources, streams, rivers, brooks, and is derived furnished more than scenic price. They were vital lifelines. Villagers would stroll, regularly a number of times a day, to attract water. The process used to be sluggish and repetitive. A character could raise a picket bucket, typically balanced with a yoke throughout the shoulders, and return with what could be managed without spillage or damage. The act itself was once unremarkable, and but principle. Every day, the identical paths had been walked, the same buckets stuffed, the identical quiet labor performed without variation or haste. Once brought home, the water was rarely used, as it may be strained via a cloth, in particular if it carried obvious debris or bugs. In some households, rudimentary filtering systems existed, easy constructions utilizing layers of sand and charcoal, extra usual amongst wealthier or extra inventive households, but for most, the water used to be utilized in its usual state, authorized for what it was. Washing with this water took several forms. There have been no showers, of course. There have been no tiled toilets or steel fixtures. Alternatively, washing used to be segmented, modest, and regularly partial. A small basin can be crammed with cold water in hotter months, or with warmed water when fuel and time allowed. The water would then be used to wash the fingers, the face, perhaps the neck. This was once a morning ritual for many, quiet, undisturbed, now not carried out with vigor or occasion, but with the same gradual cadence that defined other everyday routines. Have been washed more often than one might count on. Sandals or leather shoes, when worn, furnished little safety from the elements, and roads were unpaved. The showering of specifically in the night, used to be a small gesture toward private remedy. In some households, it was finished as an act of service, dad and mom for kids, spouses for one more. In religious settings, equivalent to monasteries or convents, The act held each spiritual and functional dimensions, performed with regularity and noted in documents and customs. When a full body wash was once attempted, it was no longer accomplished impulsively. Water needed to be heated, and heating water required fuel, which used to be now not continually in abundance. Wooden had to be gathered or purchased. Fires had to be tended with persistence. A single wood bathtub possibly crammed over the direction of an hour or more. This approach discouraged everyday bathing, and so folks would as a substitute focus on what might be maintained with much less effort. Some could suppose that this ended in preferred uncleanliness. However, the concern used to be more nuanced. Cleanliness was pursued, not in present-day absolutes, however, by way of localized, constant effort. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and had been converted extra frequently than outer apparel. These had been washed in the identical rivers and streams from which water was once drawn. The washerwomen, frequently assigned this task in both domestic and communal preparations, would kneel by the water's side, rubbing fabric over stones or wooden paddles, using lye or ash-based detergents to support. The clothes had been then spread across rocks, grass, or wooden racks to dry. Again, there was once no rush, no designated party. It used to be with ease part of existence. In urban environments, things took on fairly exceptional types. Towns and cities usually had wells, a few of which had been privately owned, whilst others had been communal. Access perhaps regulated. Distinct neighborhoods had public fountains or cisterns, primarily in areas influenced by way of Roman infrastructure. Here, water used to be still drawn manually, but the access factor was centralized. Bathhouses too, at the same time already introduced, played the extra outstanding function in towns. Folks of varying backgrounds would discuss with these facilities, no longer every day. However, on distinctive days or when circumstances required, seasonality shaped so much of this conduct. Winter confined entry. Water might freeze. Washing became more selective. Folks adapted. They protected extra of their bodies with garb and lowered the frequency of washing. Within the spring and summer, exercise resumed with rather more energy, although even then, the rhythms were sluggish and predictable. In agricultural communities, cleanliness was once, most of the time, secondary to other wishes. If cattle required care, or if vegetation wanted tending, the bathing of the self perhaps postponed. Yet it was once by no means forgotten. Throughout devout festivals or seasonal transitions, comparable to Easter or harvest, washing the body in changing garments was visible as a mark of recognize. Distinctive effort used to be made. Herbs probably brought to water. Apparel probably extra absolutely cleaned. The result was not extravagant. Nevertheless, it was once observed. On the personal degree, humans carried cloths or napkins, used to wipe the palms or face throughout the day. A moist cloth, saved in a pouch or tucked into a belt, probably used to wipe away grime or sweat. This easy object had quiet worth, although it hardly ever appears in illustrations or files. Even inside castles or manor houses, where better assets existed, water remained a constraint. It used to be carried, poured, heated, and discarded, all by human effort. Servants might aid, but the labor remained guide. Nobles did not bathe by and large. Alternatively, they used scented cloths, natural infusions, or easily accredited the PC of their world. For that reason, throughout areas and classes, the follow of washing and cleaning the physique used to be present. Now not energetic, no longer familiar, however real, deliberate, and paced, consistent with means and season. Water, consistently water, stood at the center, drawn slowly, heated gently, used modestly, poured away when spent, and so, the day handed, water fetched, faces washed, clothes rinsed, feet cleaned. The process persevered, generally overlooked, but perpetually present, regular as the passing clouds, unmarked through pleasure, untouched by means of urgency. As we proceed further into the gentle examination of medieval hygiene, our attention turns now toward the instruments, implements, and resources used to keep normal bodily and environmental cleanliness. These were not extravagant objects, nor were they embellished with needless embellishment. Instead, they were modest in development, derived from ordinary materials, and fashioned via approaches that have been repeated slowly, generation after generation. Their presence, at the same time, seldom remarked upon within the grand narratives of the technology. formed a quiet yet regular part of daily existence. Probably the most customary instruments of private hygiene were these, related to the care of the body's surface: the skin, the hair, the nails. Wooden basins, carved from ash, elm, or beech, were discovered in many properties. These vessels, often round, typically rectangular, served a couple of functions, from washing arms and faces to soaking small cloths or garments. The basins have been easy to store, long-lasting, and might be used indoors or carried external as wanted. When not in use for washing, they perhaps repurposed for food, training, or storage. Further underlining the multifunctional nature of home objects. Combs were a common object. They have been utilized by participants of all social standings and have been most likely product of bone, antler, or wood. Some were single-sided, while others featured dual rows of teeth, one coarse, one satisfactory. Their intent used to be not solely ornamental. They helped untangle hair, remove lice or particles, and, in religious communities, served as symbols of discipline and order. Combing the hair was once achieved, not with haste, but with gradual repetition, usually within the early morning or at dusk, in an area of quietude. For laundry, the epidermis, cloths manufactured from linen, had been most of the time used. These cloths had been dampened with heat, water, and gently utilized to the face, the neck, the palms. The rubbing was gentle and unhurried. There was no aggressive scrubbing. There have been no sponges, product of artificial fabric, no lube processed in factories. Rather, the cloth used to be the predominant put-in force, washed, rinsed, dried, and reused. In some cases, a handful of herbs probably steeped within the water earlier than application. Lavender, rosemary, or chamomile have been oftentimes used. Now not for his or her scent alone, however for his or her believed homes in easing infection and calming the dermis. The elements used to wash the physique were easy and locally sourced. Lye cleaning soap was among the most customary. This was made by way of a gradual method involving the gathering of wood, ash, and animal fats. The ash, when blended with water, produced a common alkaline solution. This was once then heated with rendered fats, more commonly from pigs or sheep. The resulting cleaning soap was solid, moderately coarse in texture, and carried a scent that was utilitarian instead than pleasing. It cleaned the epidermis, however might also dry it. Nonetheless, it used to be a staple item, made in batches, stored in chunks, and used sparingly in areas with extra alternate and entry to goods from distant lands. Cleaning soap with exceptional compositions used to be recognized. Castile soap, made specifically from olive oil, used to be utilized in materials of southern Europe. Its texture was smoother, its scent gentler, and its outcome on the epidermis much less harsh. However, its availability was once restrained, and it used to be ordinarily a commodity of wealthier households, or these with connections to Mediterranean commerce. It did not replace the more common asher-situated soaps, however existed alongside them in confined contexts. Other elements additionally played roles in hygiene. Sand, fine ash, and even beaten seashells were from time to time used for scrubbing, above all in the cleaning of fingers or toes. These acted as abrasives, helping to eliminate grime when water by myself used to be inadequate. The system used to be now not vigorous. A handful of sand might be rubbed gently on the palms, then rinsed with water. The motion used to be sluggish, methodical, and customarily performed outside. Herbs and common oils have been repeatedly used as balms or conditioners, now not within the feel of present-day lotions or hair cures, however as rudimentary aids to manage dryness or difficult epidermis. Tallow or animal fat, perhaps applied to cracked arms. Olive oil, when on hand, might be rubbed into hair or beards. These weren't luxury remedies. They had been quiet adaptations to environmental publicity, to wind, solar, and cold, and had been undertaken without ceremony. Nails had been trimmed with small knives, or by using biting. There have been no specialized clippers. Rather, the renovation of nails was once and character accountability, carried out with available instruments. Excessively lengthy nails weren't seen favorably. Now not for aesthetic explanations alone. However, because of the functional demands of work, clean, short nails have been simpler to keep in each agricultural and domestic settings. Dental hygiene, although primitive by means of modern-day specifications, used to be no longer totally absent. Twigs from particular timber, similar to hazel, willow, or birch, have been chewed unless the fibers grew to be delicate and brush-like. These had been used to rub the teeth and gums. Ash or salt used to be routinely added as a cleaning agent. Fabric might even be used to wipe the mouth, though no toothpaste existed, and no formal dental occupation for the normal man or woman. The importance of oral care was not fully overlooked. It was once pursued in modest, repetitive gestures that mirrored the identical quiet concentration given to the leisure of the physique. The storage of these items was once additionally subdued. There have been no cupboards stuffed with vials, no cabinets of branded hygiene merchandise. Combs were carried in small material pouches or stored in chests. Soaps were wrapped in linen and stored with care. Cloths had been washed and hung close. The hearth to dry. Brithty had a situation. But there was once little show or discussion of hygiene tools. Their presence used to be assumed, their use familiar, and their value functional. In monasteries and other religious environments, inventories usually listed these gadgets: a distinct quantity of combs, a suite of basins, a timetable for laundering. Cliffs. These small print had been famous no longer for vanity, but for order. Cleanliness used to be considered an element of self-discipline. The tools mirrored that principle. Thus, as we detect the tools and supplies of medieval hygiene, we are not greeted by novelty or speedy innovation. As a substitute, we see continuity, we see patience, we see modest, realistic objects serving modest, practical purposes. The rhythm of their use used to be steady. The percent was sluggish. The outcome, though unspectacular, were adequate for the time. In this method, the medieval character remained clean, not within the glowing, perfumed feel of modernity, but through repetition, by way of familiarity, via the gentle, day-to-day effort to control the physique's wants with the resources on hand. There was once no race. There used to be no revolution. Simplest quiet care, one combed hair and one washed hand at a time. As we proceed this calm and deliberate exploration of medieval hygiene, it turns into imperative to shift our focus to the world of monastic life. Inside the structured partitions of monasteries, where silence used to be valued, the place order prevailed, and where day-to-day life followed the cadence of bells and liturgical hours, cleanliness used to be no longer omitted. As a substitute, it was embedded gently within routines, by no means exaggerated. Under no circumstances rushed, however present, nevertheless in methods that have been each spiritual and useful. Monasteries for the period of the center, a long time, were greater than places of prayer. They were centers of preservation, of cultivation, and of ritual. The whole thing had its time and situation. Duties have been organized in line with the guideline, most quite often the rule of Saint Benedict in Western Europe, which ruled no longer only prayer and gain knowledge of, but additionally labor, foods, sleep, and hygiene. Cleanliness, for this reason, used to be no longer an afterthought. It was once part of the rhythm of obedience and humility. The rule of thumb of Saint Benedict, compiled in the 6th century and used for hundreds of years after, contains certain references to washing. It states, for example, that monks should wash their arms before ingredients. This was no longer in basic terms a topic of wellness, although wellness will have been a quiet benefit. As a substitute, it reflected self-discipline and training. To clean before consuming was once to renown the act of nourishment as sacred, and to strategiate with reverence. The washing itself was once easy. A basin, a pitcher of water, a material. There was no fanfare. The act was implemented slowly, customarily in silence, after which handed along to the following brother in line. Communal lavatoriums, that is. Spaces detailed for hand-washing had been a part of many monastic complexes. These weren't complex constructions, normally a protracted stone trough with a drainage approach and access to flowing water, small basins probably inset alongside the length. Water was once more often than not piped in through clay or lead conduits. Generally, herbs had been grown regional to sweeten the scent of the field, although this was not constantly the case. The lavatorium used to be more often than not headquartered near the refectory or dining hall to facilitate orderly routines. Bathing, in the full feel, used to be much less time-honored but no longer unknown. Monks did bathe. The frequency, nevertheless, varied relying on the order, the climate, and the assets to be had. In some houses, notably the extra prosperous, monks probably distributed a shower every few weeks, in others, once per season. The bathtub was not an indulgence but a duty. It was scheduled. It was quiet. Water had to be fetched, heated, poured. The approach was on the whole assisted through more youthful monks or servants, applied in rotation, and recorded as part of the house's ongoing movements. Hair was trimmed on the whole. Now, not as an aesthetic preference, however, as a sign of humility and obedience. Tonsure, the shaving of the crown of the head, marked religious commitment. It additionally made hair less complicated to manage. Combs had been issued, mostly carved with symbolic detail, although constantly simple in structure. Hair and beard care have been basic, a moist cloth perhaps used. Oil, if to be had, would be applied sparingly. There was no perfume, no styling, simplest control and ease. Linen habits, the robes worn by using monks, had been also cleaned, not weekly, and now not continuously fully, but with regularity. Garments had been brushed, overwhelmed to eliminate dust, and sometimes washed in gigantic troughs. Ash cleaning soap or lye was once used when on hand. Drying used to be completed by using draping clothes over hedges or wood frames within the open air. There were schedules for this as good, and distinct monks have been assigned laundry obligations as a part of their everyday labor. It was now not a punishment. It was a contribution to the functioning of the whole. Feet have been washed for the duration of special rituals. Essentially, the most wonderful of these used to be the Maundy Thursday foot washing, a reenactment of Christ washing the toes of his disciples. On this present day, the abbot might wash the ft of his monks, or the monks would wash the feet of the poor. This act was no longer performed quickly. It was once deliberate, methodical, and symbolic. Heat, water, a basin, a material. Each foot was once dealt with care, dried with awareness, and covered again. The act reminded the participants of humility, of provider, of shared humanity. Cleanliness in monasteries expanded to the spaces themselves. Cloisters were swept, kitchens had been scoured, dormitories had been aired when climate authorized. The lavatorium used to be kept in working order. Each monk had duties that touched upon the cleanliness of his environment. Though these tasks were not recorded with grand language, they had been carried out with consistency. The monastery used to be no longer a location of luxury. Nevertheless, it was once a situation of rhythm, of order, and of tender protection. Even throughout durations of illness or plague, monastic records show efforts to preserve cleanliness. Infirmaries had their possessed washing basins. Linens have been boiled or burned. Tools had been cleaned or replaced. While working out of contamination was once rudimentary, there existed a deep sense of obligation towards each, the physique and the spirit. Cleanliness in this method used to be not only for health. It was once part of sanctity. It was an offering, a quiet type of devotion expressed no longer in words but in action. In Japanese monasticism, akin to in Byzantine or Orthodox traditions, identical patterns had been determined. There, too, monks bathed when authorized. There, too, washing before ingredients or offerings was once anticipated. The tools and rituals diversified slightly, formed via local weather and doctrine, but the principle remained the same. Order in the body prompted order within the soul. For this reason, in monasteries, these gradual stone-walled communities of reflection, cleanliness took its place, no longer as a luxurious, however, as a quiet part of the entire. It was once neither glamorous nor neglected. It was constructed into the fabric of obedience, of formality, of daily living. A monk washed not to be admired. However, considering the fact that the rule stated he cleaned his habit no longer for display. However, for discipline. He combed his hair not out of vanity. However, for the reason that order was once expected. On this means, across centuries and areas, the monastic process to cleanliness presents us a glimpse into how hygiene was understood, no longer as an isolated act, but as part of a better system of life. Consistent, scheduled, spiritually grounded, repeated, now not for awareness, however for the quiet excellence of the neighborhood. As we continue our gradual and unhurried journey by means of the hygiene practices of the Middle While, we now arrive at an area that stands somewhat aside from the domestic basin, the monastic lavatorium, or the solitary fabric soaked in warmed river water. That is the gap of the general public bathhouse, a constitution that, even as varying in type, function, and frequency of use across unique areas and centuries, however, held a constant, if quite often understated, positioning. The panorama of medieval cleanliness. The concept of the public bathhouse was once not a medieval invention. Its origins stretched again through the stone corridors of Rome, where the thermae, large, difficult bathing facilities, had once flourished. Though the grand stone halls of antiquity had largely fallen into disrepair via the early medieval interval, they have an effect on Lingard. In some areas, peculiarly southern Europe, the ruins were repurposed or maintained. Elsewhere, new bathhouses were developed, humbler in scale, however sensible in intent. These amenities, relying on local custom and to-be-had resources, ranged from easy picket huts, closed sizzling springs, to extra-complex stone-built structures. In urban centers, in Islamic regions of medieval Europe, akin to Al-Andalus and today, Spain or Sicily, below Arab affect, the culture of the hammam remained specially robust. These bathhouses continued older Roman and Persian practices, emphasizing not simply washing but sequence, beginning in heat rooms, transitioning through sizzling steam, then cooling off steadily. The experience was once no longer rushed. It was once carried out with care. Bathers moved slowly from chamber to chamber, pausing, resting, cleansing, and repeating. In Christian Europe, bathhouses have been extra varied of their acceptance and utilization throughout the early medieval interval, specifically across the 9th to 11th centuries. There is proof that many cities maintained such corporations. These were not extravagant locations. A bathhouse might consist of 1 or 2 rooms, a heated room with a significant tub or small pool, and a changing subject. Water was heated in significant cauldrons using wooden or peat, then carried or channeled into the bathing chamber. The approach used to be time-consuming. Attendants, in most cases regional laborers or section-time staff, had been in charge. For renovation, smooth water was scarce and hence reused. The bath used to be communal. Bathhouses, in most cases, served as locations not just for washing but also for social interplay. Individuals would speak, alternate information, or effortlessly rest together. Men and females might bathe on alternate days, or in some areas, share the identical facility with partitioned or scheduled access. The mood was mainly subdued, not celebratory. There used to be no music. There were no refreshments. Most effective heat, air, steam, and gradual dialogue. The experience was once realistic, but now not rushed. That in some cities, guilds or official associations maintained their own bathhouses. These had been used by participants and their households. The rules of entry, utilization, and cleanliness have been posted or recited orally. Bathing used to be influenced at certain intervals, monthly or around feast days. It was once hardly ever spontaneous. Notices might be circulated or introduced in the town rectangular. Men and women made preparations. Cleaning soap was more commonly offered on website, probably a rough ash-established kind, utilized through hand or with material. Some bathhouses provided combs, although most customers introduced their possess. Water used to be carried in wood buckets. Floors have been of stone or packed clay. Walls had been undeniable. The atmosphere was subdued. There used to be little ornamentation, except possibly a single devotional picture or carved inscription, supplying a blessing or simple steerage. With the aid of the 13th and 14th centuries, the role of bathhouses started out to say no. In many areas of Europe, especially in the West, a mixture of motives contributed to this sluggish retreat. Concerns over morality, voiced through clerical authorities, grew louder. The mingling of genders, even with restrictions, used to be noticeable by way of some as a hazard to non-secular self-discipline. At the same time, outbreaks of disorder, most principally the plague, created suspicion round communal water use and closed moist spaces. Though now not founded on modern-day germ idea, this suspicion was once ample to curb attendance. In some cities, bathhouses closed completely. In others, they remained, however, were used less on the whole, quite often reserved for the sick or the bad, supported by using OMS. Nevertheless, in other materials of Europe, notably within the Jap areas and beneath Byzantine or Islamic rule, the bathhouse way of life continued longer. In Constantinople, in Aleppo, in Cairo, the hammam continued its gradual, echoing cycle of steam, rinse, and rest. The walls of those bathhouses absorbed centuries of low conversation, splashing water, and rhythmic brushing. There was a continuity, In practice, a familiarity, a appreciate for the system. Bathhouse etiquette used to be simple. Silence was revered. Nudity, although long established, was approached with modesty. Towels or linen wraps were used. Scrubbing was once tender. Water used to be poured slowly. There have been no abrupt actions. The act of washing, like so many other medieval routines, adopted a PC no longer dictated via urgency. However, by means of way of life, it used to be now not distinctive for a bather to stay for over an hour. Now, not out of luxurious, but out of adherence to the steps. In Japan, throughout the identical medieval interval, communal bathing in onsen or dispachador likewise reflected this structured technique, though become independent from European customs. While past our predominant geographical scope, the similarity in percent and rationale is worth smooth acknowledgement, even as the popularity of public bathhouses waned. In some areas, their impact remained. The concept of washing the whole physique, now not simply the face or palms, did not vanish. It moved inward, into properties, or upward, into religious observe. The facilities themselves, where nonetheless standing, have been in many instances transformed to other makes use of storehouses, hospitals, and even chapels. In others, the stone walls stood silent, visited only by the wind and the occasional vacationer. In these days, archaeological stays and written files permit us to reconstruct, with cautious accuracy, the situation these enterprises held in the medieval world, no longer dramatic, now not glamorous, but present, stable, serving their function within the sluggish, ordinary cycle of medieval life. And so, the bathhouse, with its warmed stones, its delicate echo of dripping water, its easy benches and pale light offers us yet another glimpse into the quiet efforts made by average individuals to remain easy, no longer dazzlingly easy, not obsessively clean, but sufficiently clean for their time, for his or her beliefs, and for their daily comfort. As our consistent passage by way of the panorama of medieval hygiene continues, we now shift center of attention to the geographical region, to the extensive, open stretches of rural lifestyles, where the majority of medieval individuals lived and worked. It is here, within the villages, the farmsteads, and the small hamlets scattered across hills and valleys, that cleanliness was once approached not as ceremony or rule-certain ritual, however, as part of a broader rhythm of survival. Lifestyles among the peasantry used to be marked through repetition, practicality, and the slow passage of seasons. Hygiene, like most matters in rural existence, was once humble, regular, and largely dictated by using the land itself. For the peasant, time was ruled not by way of clocks, however by using the function of the sun, the cycle of crops, and the toll of bells from far-off churches. Water sources have been often restrained to the nearest stream, spring, or communal well. Fetching water was a day-to-day task, certainly not as soon as, however mainly repeatedly for the duration of the day. The act was carried out with consistency, no longer urgency. Wood buckets had been crammed, balanced on yokes, and carried back to houses of bushes and wattle. Thatched roofs above and tough-packed earth below. The residence, known as a croft or cottage, was small and simple. It typically housed an entire household in a single or two-room association. There used to be no separate area for washing, no committed room for bathing. Instead, washing was performed in corners, close the hearth, or external and reasonable. Whether a wooden basin, commonly shared between loved ones, participants, was used for the cleansing of arms, faces, and toes. Greater washing of the entire body was infrequent and frequently seasonal. In hotter months, members would bathe in neighborhood streams, both in solitude or with others of the same gender. It was once now not a leisure activity. It was achieved quietly and with effectivity. Cleaning soap, when available, was once coarse and homemade. It was once crafted in small batches, if, in any respect, from ashes and leftover fats. No longer each family made their own. Customarily, a village would have one household that produced soap and traded it in small bars. The odor used to be sharp, the texture tough, and the outcomes on dermis drying, but it served its motive. When soap used to be unavailable, ash, alone possibly rubbed on the fingers or scalp, adopted through rinsing in cool water. The outcome was never high-priced. It was sufficient. Hair care among rural humans used to be minimal. Hair was once lengthy or brief, depending on individual alternative, practicality, or customized. Combs carved from wooden or horn had been used sparingly. Lice and other pests were original and handled via combing, software of vinegar or oil, or, in more severe circumstances, chopping the hair. There used to be little vainness in such routines. They had been performed for relief, for operate, and for the control of irritation. Kids have been combed by way of their mums. Elderly villagers usually received aid from more youthful relatives. The method was gradual, in many instances painful, and carried out with a resigned persistence. Clothing, likewise, was cleaned sparingly. A peasant might possess just 1 or 2 units of garments. Undergarments, ordinarily manufactured from coarse linen, were worn closest to the skin and washed extra usually. Outer garments, woolen tunics, cloaks, aprons, were brushed and aired, no longer more commonly washed. Washing garments was once a labor-intensive project. Clothes were soaked in wood tubs or troughs, normally stomped or pounded with paddles, and then rinsed in streams. Drying took place in open fields or over fences. There have been no soap suds, no soft scents. Best water, effort, and time. Hygiene practices additionally multiplied to animals, instruments, and living areas. Pens have been cleared of waste, now not every day, but as needed. Ashes from the hearth were regularly scattered on flooring to take in moisture and scent. Bedding, generally straw, used to be changed when it grew to become too foul to endure. Fleas and bugs were widespread intruders. Smoke from the fireside, stored burning almost continuously, helped to pressure them away. It used to be a passive, ongoing form of pest control. Now not best, but ample. Fingers have been washed earlier than ingredients when water was once on hand. Now, not ceremoniously, but in view that food used to be most likely eaten by means of hand, and on account that dirty palms interfered with taste and texture. Kids discovered this early. Now, not as a moral lesson, however, via repetition. Within the fields, water may be carried in a dermis or flask. A fabric dipped in it might be used to wipe sweat or dirt. These gestures were modest and quiet. During instances of devout observance, further awareness perhaps paid to appearance. Holy days, feast days, and seasonal galas encouraged villagers to wash more wholly, to sweep their hair, to vary into their excellent clothes. In this day and age have been spaced throughout the year and served as tender prompts for individual care. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals also called for laundry and grooming, though nonetheless inside the manner of the loved ones. Bathrooms, as we realize them in these days, didn't exist in rural households. Alternatively, waste was deposited in pits outside the home or mostly at the back of a monitor or hedge. Chamber pots were used indoors, particularly throughout winter or at night time, and emptied daily. The smell was once anticipated, though minimized by way of masking the pit with soil or ash. There have been no plumbing programs, no sanitation departments. Cleanliness on this side, as in others, was established on movements and manual effort. There were no mirrors in most homes. A reflection might be caught in a bucket of water or a sophisticated metallic floor, but appearance was once no longer consistently monitored. There used to be no average of beauty past practicality. A clean face, a brushed head of hair, and a suite of presentable clothing have been regarded ample for most occasions, even for the duration of health problem. Efforts have been made to maintain some measure of hygiene. Cloths were used to chill the forehead or clean the mouth. Water was once offered to wash palms. Dirty bedding was eliminated when force accredited. There were no hospitals. Neighbors could support. The parish priest might discuss with the rhythm of care, although restricted with the aid of resources, remained regular. And so, within the geographical region, hygiene used to be no longer not noted. It was practiced in small, consistent gestures, drawing water, brushing dust, washing toes, airing clothes. There have been no manuals, no diagrams, no complex methods. Handiest habit, reminiscence, and the teachings of older generations. It used to be no longer fast. It was now not glamorous. Nevertheless, it used to be actual, and it was once adequate for the time. In this quiet cycle of fetching and washing, combing and drying, the rural population of medieval Europe maintained a degree of cleanliness suitable to their world, shaped with the aid of land, via climate, by way of life, and by using the enduring, sluggish-paced repetition of day-to-day life. As we continue our gradual and measured exploration of hygiene in the medieval world, It becomes correct to turn now toward the delicate distinctions that existed across gender and age. Cleanliness, whilst shared as a value and a necessity, used to be not approached identically by using all participants. Distinct expectations, roles, and biological needs shaped the hygiene practices of men, women, and youngsters. Yet these variations were not dramatic. They emerged gently, formed through perform, culture, and the social patterns of the time. The distinctions were not normally formalized, but they have been understood, handed down, and quietly discovered. Guys and women, although alike in lots of their day-to-day routines, held separate tasks that influenced their process to cleanliness. In rural areas, guys spent much of their time outdoor, in the fields, with animals, or traveling between cities. Their hygiene hence focused extra on outside cleaning of the palms, feet, and face. Washing passed off earlier than meals, upon returning house, or before coming into a church. Cleaning soap used to be used when to be had, although water alone was once normal. Hair may be trimmed seasonally, or left long depending on regional fashion and climate. Beards were worn with the aid of many adult men, and these too have been cleaned with water and combed sometimes. In noble households or city settings, grooming possibly more involved, however, nonetheless remained a slow and rare approach. Ladies, then again, managed duties often headquartered across the dwelling, cooking, weaving, laundering, and caring for youngsters. Their publicity to grime got here now, not from the subject, but from the hearth, the backyard, the wash basin, and the fabric. For this reason, their hygiene routines most commonly concerned typical hand washing, as good as cleansing of the fingers and face. Washing garments placed them extra quite often. Close water. Women have been also the important caregivers, both for the young and for the in poor health, and as a result participated more in washing others, wiping foreheads, washing limbs, brushing hair. These tasks, while unrecorded in most authentic files, were part of the slow fabric of everyday existence. When it got here to bathing, each men and women followed identical seasonal patterns, though commonly individually. In communal bathhouses or river areas, guys and women bathed at one-of-a-kind times or in different areas. Modesty was maintained not just for ethical factors, however, for remedy and tradition. Inside households, females could bathe younger kids, and now and again bathed along with older daughters when stipulations allowed. Men did the same with young sons. Full physique washing was rare and finished, simplest when time, water, and warmth permitted. Partial washing of the fingers, face, and feet was more movements and generally didn't range greatly between genders. Hair care did, however, exhibit more variant. Women often wore their hair longer, either braided, bound, or included. Single women might wear their hair unfastened on distinct days. At the same time, married females had been expected to quilt theirs in public. This supposed extra widespread brushing, and more typical use of combs. These combs, most of the time fabricated from wood, horn, or bone, had been passed down from mother to daughter. Hair oil, usually derived from herbs or animal fats, might be utilized to tame the strands and cut down tangling. The approach of brushing hair used to be sluggish and repetitive, and ordinarily performed in pairs. A mum brushing her daughter's hair at night, or a sister helping yet another dot in phrases of bodily care. Females had certain needs concerning menstruation and childbirth. Fabric rags, in many instances layered and tied with easy belts, had been used to soak up menstrual blood. These were washed with the aid of hand and reused. There was no disposal method. Water was fetched, soap was once utilized if on hand, and the cloths had been dried in daylight when feasible. Throughout childbirth, females had been assisted by means of midwives, who introduced clean linens, heat, water, and talents handed down orally by means of generations. Cleanliness was found not handiest to prevent infection, but when you consider that it was once related to care and piety. After start, both the mother and the child can be washed gently, now not as a ceremony, however as a necessity. Youngsters, in the meantime, followed the hygiene habits of their households. They had been washed via their mum and dad when very younger, with a humid cloth, in a basin, or in a shared tub, for the duration of the hotter months. Hair used to be combed, regularly, unwillingly, and garments had been converted when dirty. Kids more often than not owned fewer items of garb and spent more time barefoot, above all in summertime. Palms and toes had been most frequently washed, primarily before eating or drowsing. The smell of smoke, earth, or food used to be acquainted on their dermis and clothes, however not considered fallacious. Sicknesses have been addressed with basic hygiene, cleaning of wounds, wiping of faces, and the boiling of cloths. Among the many aged hygiene grew to become easier. Mobility was once lowered. Washing perhaps carried out with the help of others, a daughter, a servant, a fellow monk. The aged were respected, and their care was most commonly gradual and tender. Basins had been dropped at them. Cloths had been warmed through the hearth. Toes were soaked. Fingernails trimmed. Hair combed without haste. These small gestures of hygiene were expressions of love, now not carried out for exhibit. However, for relief and dignity, there have been no advanced medical cures, no sterile environments, handiest water, fabric, and time. Throughout all, a long time engenders. The availability of water, gasoline, and cloth decided how most likely hygiene routines might be applied. Modesty, shaped by using faith and group expectations, guided how our bodies have been visible and washed. There used to be no common. As a substitute, there was once a quiet adaptability, one who allowed members to remain reasonably smooth inside the scope of their labor, their local weather, and their station in existence. In noble households, gender expectations had been more formally expressed. However, the common patterns remained unidentical. Women in ready would guide a noblewoman along with her hair, bathing, or wardrobe. Male attendants could support a lord with shaving or dressing. But even right here, these actions weren't established, and the objects used, combs, basins, soap, differed little in essence from those discovered in less complicated homes. The change lay in access and frequency, now not in approach. Thus, medieval hygiene, although formed partly through gender and age, remained rooted in fashioned wants and on-hand resources, whether or not a person strolling back from the subject, a woman folding clean linen, a baby washed before supper, or an elder warmed by means of the fireplace. The gestures of cleanliness had been similar of their percent, unhurried, repetitive, and grounded within the truth of everyday life. As we gently continue by way of the long and constant corridors of medieval lifestyles, we now arrive at an area that, at the same time interconnected with cleanliness, sits moderately aside. The connection between hygiene and health. To communicate of hygiene is to speak of routines, of tools, of substances and schedules. To speak of health, nevertheless, is to realize how men and women understood the results of those routines, how they interpreted sickness, and what meanings they assigned. To cleanliness itself, there have been no microscopes in the medieval world. There was once no understanding of microorganism or viruses, but suggestions of purity, steadiness, and bodily order were very a lot alive. Slow-moving standards, shaped through devout concept, historical philosophy, and quiet expertise. The dominant scientific framework for the period of a lot of medieval Europe was once headquartered on the theory of the four humours. This conception, inherited from Greco-Roman antiquity, certainly from Hippocrates and Galen, proposed that the body was governed through four primary fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Every was associated with features: hot, cold, moist, dry, and with temperaments and elements. Wellness was understood, not in phrases of pathogens or contagion, however, in phrases of stability. When the humours had been in equilibrium, the physique used to be good. After they were not, health problem arose. Inside this framework, hygiene had a modest but significant position. Bathing, for example, was once visible no longer simply with the intention to take away dirt, however, as a way of restoring stability. Warm baths opened the pores, softened the dermis, and were believed to permit extra humours or hazardous vapours to exit the physique. Conversely, cold baths have been used to firm the body, to sluggish strategies perceived as overactive. Physicians, certainly these trained in tuition settings, typically prescribed bathing as part of a medication routine, but they did so cautiously. Overbathing used to be regarded damaging, because it was once proposal to weaken the physique and open it to outside influences. Smooth air was once also emphasized. The proposal of miasma, that's ailment prompted through unhealthy or corrupted air, was once extensively accredited. Foul odors had been associated with ailment. Accordingly, personal cleanliness used to be linked with the avoidance of stench. Lavenders, rosemary, and mint were hung in homes. Streets, the place permitted, were swept to lower the build-up of waste. For the duration of times of plague, Persons carried pomanders, small balls of fragrant supplies, to thrust back health. Problem: the purpose used to be now not disinfection in the cutting-edge experience, but rather the legislation of the physique's atmosphere to retain its interior harmony. Smooth garb, too, performed a position on this conception of well-being, even as clothes weren't modified every day. Undergarments, mainly these made from linen, were washed more and more commonly. Linen was regarded cooling and drying, favorable to a healthful complexion. Physicians instructed that clothes now not be worn too long without cleansing, not necessarily given that of germs, but given that historical sweat and dust were believed to breed detrimental vapors. The odor of the physique was not fully condemned. However, it was managed with concentration to perceived health effects. Among monastic and clerical writers, cleanliness took on a more religious tone. Dust on the body was in many instances in comparison with sin on the soul. Although ascetic traditions by and large promoted endurance of affliction, many rules nonetheless emphasized average hygiene as a part of discipline. A monk might wash his arms earlier than meals, not most effective to preclude grime. However, as a sign of inward instruction, health problem used to be probably interpreted as divine punishment, a scan of religion, or a name to repentance. Cleanliness of the body, while certainly not divorced from these beliefs, was obvious as acquired virtue, neither a moderate nor neglected. In occasions of widespread sickness, hygiene practices did shift. During outbreaks of plague, most in particular, the Black Loss of life in the mid-14th century, people replied in quite a lot of approaches. Some withdrew wholly from communal contact, others intensified their cleansing routines, and some became to prayer and penance in hopes of divine intervention. Physicians, lacking a transparent figuring out of infection, mainly endorsed the burning of fragrant woods, the closing of windows in the course of specified winds, and the avoidance of crowded areas. Bathing during plague outbreaks was discouraged. In some areas, as it was once feared that open pores allowed the plague to enter, regardless of the boundaries of their talents. Medieval persons found patterns. They seen that detailed conditions, bred illness, unclean water, rotting meals, crowded housing. They won't have understood causation. However, they replied to correlation. Wells were repeatedly closed. Markets have been regulated. Cities introduced ordinances for waste elimination and road cleaning, in particular in the later medieval interval. These efforts weren't common, but they exhibit an evolving awareness of environment and health. In villages, abilities of cleanliness and well-being, handed by means of oral lifestyle. Elders shared advice on when to bathe, what herbs to use, and easy methods to maintain wounds. Easy treatments, honey for cuts, vinegar for washing, herbs for bathing were passed down not by way of texts, however through demonstration. There were no hospitals in most rural areas, most effective occasional healers or clergy. The act of washing a sick person, altering their linens, or bathing a fevered baby was once done not out of scientific understanding, but from dependency, love, and hope. Among the nobility, extra assets allowed for larger version in health-associated hygiene. Physicians would be consulted. Specific bathing rooms were built. Herbal mixtures have been all set and applied with the aid of attendants. But even in these circles, the belief in stability, moderately, in environmental control, remained dominant. Cleanliness was once no longer basically cosmetic. It was a part of a broader effort to stay in harmony with the body's desires and the arena's unseen forces. For this reason, the medieval relationship between hygiene and well-being used to be cautious, considerate, and shaped by using the gradual evolution of ideas. There were no unexpected revolutions, no radical alterations, only gradual adaptations told by observation, belief, and necessity. Cleanliness was once no longer pursued for its possessed sake, nor fully neglected. It used to be a part of lifestyle's regular rhythm, a way of preserving steadiness, showing recognize for the physique, and responding, however imperfectly, to the challenges of health problem. As we reflect on these quiet routines, the soaking of material, the steeping of herbs, the sluggish pouring of heat water, we start to look that medieval hygiene, although extraordinary from our own, used to be no longer without that means. It was considerate, repetitive, and carefully tied to the rhythms of well-being as they have been then understood. Not medical, not sterile, however careful, in its possessed sluggish and faithful way. As our quiet and deliberate experience through medieval hygiene continues to unfold, we now process a dimension less physical and more symbolic. The location, the place, cleanliness met the sacred, where bodily washing intertwined with non-secular meaning, and where purity was once no longer basically epidermis deep, but profoundly inside. For the individuals of the middle while, cleanliness was once no longer only a functional crisis. It used to be additionally a ritual, a metaphor, a self-discipline, and, from time to time, an announcement of devotion. Religion, which shaped each aspect of medieval existence, infused acts of washing and cleaning with deeper layers of reason and order. Both Christianity and Islam, the dominant religious traditions in Europe, and the broader Mediterranean maintained robust traditions, involving ritual purity. Although differing in doctrine and kind, each considered exact varieties of washing as greater than hygienic. They had been preparations for contact with the divine. These acts have been gradual, deliberate, and structured. There was once no haste in their execution, for they have been considered acts of humility, reverence, and inward reflection. In Christian Europe, principally in monastic and ecclesiastical circles, washing took situation before sacred obligations. A priest washed his arms before celebrating the Mass, no longer most effective to cleanse filth, but to sign readiness to handle the sacred vessels and elements. This washing, referred to as the lavabo, was once more often than not accompanied, via a prayer, a quiet attraction for internal purification. The water was once poured slowly, sometimes by using an assistant, right into a simple basin. A fabric was used to dry the fingers. The gesture was modest, repeated, and meditative. The people, too, engaged in symbolic cleanliness. Earlier than getting into a church, it was once no longer distinguished to wash the arms or the face, primarily on feast days or before taking communion. In some places, holy water fonts had been positioned at entrances, shallow stone basins stuffed with blessed water. The trustworthy would dip their fingers, trace the sign of the go, and in doing so, enact a small ceremony of cleaning, both physical and spiritual. The water was once cool. The movement used to be practiced was once no guideline indispensable. It was effectively recognized in baptism, a significant rite of Christian lifestyles. Water played a role of total transformation. Toddlers, and in some instances adults, were washed in water as a sign of latest existence, of forgiveness, of belonging to a community of religion. The act was once carried out slowly, with care, and most likely by means of a priest or bishop. The water perhaps poured, or the physique immersed, relying on customized. Clothes had been changed, candles had been lit. The air was nonetheless. This used to be not a cleansing of grime, however of common sin, an inspiration deeply rooted in medieval theology. In monasteries, ideas as a rule distinct typical washing, not just for wellness, but for non-secular self-discipline. Smooth garments have been to be worn for prayer and liturgy, fingernails trimmed, beard stored so as a monk's outward state was expected to reflect inward devotion. Cleanliness was now not prideful, it used to be reverent. The regularity of these acts gave them a rhythm, a sluggish, repeated sample that created a sense of calm and order. Day by day, season after season, pilgrims, too, paid awareness to cleaning. Earlier than atmosphere, out on long journeys to places like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome, travelers would wash their toes, their fingers, their faces. This was once executed not as a training for comfort, but for humility. In some shrines, bathing used to be influenced earlier than coming into the sacred house. Springs, thought to be holy, provided water that used to be believed to heal, no longer just the body, but additionally the soul. The act of washing in these waters was once slow and deliberate. Pilgrims waited their turn. They stepped into the water quietly. They whispered prayers, then they dried themselves with difficult fabric and persevered on their path. Within the Islamic world of the medieval period, ritual purity used to be likewise made correctly, more formally codified. The observe of wudu or ablution was carried out earlier than every of the 5 everyday prayers. The method was once regular, washing the palms, mouth, nose, face, fingers, head, ears, and in a distinctive order, with calm and measured motion. This act, repeated a couple of instances every day, created a rhythm of bodily mindfulness that permeated everyday existence. It was once no longer rushed. It was once not mechanized. It was once a pause, a transition from the everyday to the sacred. In mosques, Fountains and basins had been hooked up to support this ritual. The sound of flowing water accompanied prayer. Footwear had been removed. Silence used to be located. This repeated washing served both hygienic and religious services, getting ready the individual not just to wish, but to stand earlier than the Creator in a state of physical and symbolic readiness for states of greater impurity, corresponding to after sexual exercise or menstruation. A full-body ritual bath, referred to as ghusl, used to be required. This was once performed with the equal care and intention, by and large at dwelling or in specified areas. The emphasis was on modesty, order, and completion. Water touched every part of the physique. Clothes were converted. The soul was readied all over again for prayer, for group, and for reflection. Jewish communities in medieval Europe to maintain traditions of ritual washing. The mikveh, a ritual tub used for purification, especially by way of females, after menstruation or childbirth, was a part of a better sample of sanctified water use, though files are fewer as a result of the marginalization of these communities. Archaeological evidence and textual sources attest to their consistent participation in this broader tradition of symbolic cleanliness. Even in pagan or traditions, the place Christian or Islamic teachings had now not wholly taken root. Water remained a boundary between the usual and the sacred. Springs had been visited. Our bodies were washed before seasonal rites. Choices have been made close rivers. The organization of water with renewal, rebirth, and purification was each historical and enduring. Consequently, during the medieval world, throughout areas and faiths, cleanliness was no longer restrained to cleaning soap or dermis. It touched the soul. It marked transitions from the secular to the sacred, from the impure to the appropriate, from isolation to belonging. The act of washing was once greater than a mission. It was once a signal, a gesture, a pause. It was once executed no longer with excitement, however with intention. These rituals did not purpose to cleanse the body by myself. They served to situation the man or woman in suitable relation to God, to others, and to themselves. The water used was once ordinarily plain. The motions have been discovered early and repeated endlessly, and yet the significance remained quiet, consistent, gently reinforced via way of life and time. In these calm and rhythmic acts of ritual purity, we find possibly the clearest expression of medieval hygienes, deeper, which means it was once now not normally about elimination, however about restoration, now not best of the physique, but of order, no longer in haste, but with patience, a gradual washing, a deep breath, a return to steadiness. As our exploration reaches its final phase, we turn now to the closing centuries of the medieval interval, a time no longer of sudden transformation, however of gradual transition. The late core, while stretching from the 14th to the early 16th centuries, didn't erase the customs of the earlier, but it surely did start, slowly and quietly, to reshape them. Hygiene, like so many different features of everyday life, changed now, not in dramatic bursts, but in a long, drawn-out fading and emergence, the historical routines softening, the new ones forming faint outlines. In the early medieval world, we noticed how washing used to be local, seasonal, and ritualistic, how water was fetched, how cleaning soap used to be made, how faces had been wiped, and FT had been soaked with quiet persistence. These habits did not disappear with the passing of years, but they did to shift. Urbanization, exchange, changing religious outlooks, and the sluggish accumulation of skills all performed a role. By way of the top of the 15th century, the hygiene of medieval individuals had no longer grown to be modern day, but it had ended up one of a kind, subtly, steadily, and virtually invisibly. Cities have been growing, populations accelerated, streets grew to be narrower, and structures stood closer. In these denser environments, considerations about waste, air, and water, high quality, grew to become extra pressing. Nearby councils and town governments, almost always known as burgomasters, aldermen, or city wardens, issued ordinances on the place waste might be dumped, how frequently cesspits must be emptied, and which professions could operate within. City partitions, barbers, butchers, and tanners have been sometimes relocated external, the partitions to restrict smells and runoff. These small laws, repeated 12 months after year, shaped the groundwork for what would finally come to be public well-being coverage. Bathhouses, once common in lots of cities, had begun their slow decline. As noted, previous considerations about morality and contagion, especially throughout repeated waves of plague, ended in the closing or repurposing of many communal bathing facilities. Some bathhouses remained, peculiarly in bigger cities, or in areas with continued cultural ties to Islamic or Byzantine traditions, but many pale into disuse of their place. Smaller private washing arrangements started out to emerge, although handiest among the wealthier lessons. Among the aristocracy and higher city households, the concept of private cleanliness commenced to conform, not necessarily toward extra widespread bathing, but towards more attention to presentation. Linen undergarments had been modified extra most often. Perfumes, scented oils, and powders grew to become more and more standard, not as substitutes for washing entirely, however, as dietary supplements. Aromatic herbs had been positioned inside of clothing. Gloves had been perfumed. Hair used to be dusted with scented powders or frivolously oiled. These practices have been rooted more in aesthetics than in scientific quandary. However, they altered the best way cleanliness was once perceived. Printed books, appearing within the second half of the 15th century, started to circulate scientific and loved ones' recommendation to wider audiences. Manuals for midwives, treatises on well-being, and even publications to just right manners touched upon the importance of washing, the association of latrines, and the care of garments. Though many of those books remained accessible simplest to literate elites, they signaled a slow action toward codification, the taking pictures of routines in written kind, what used to be as soon as oral lifestyle grew to be printed recommendation. The monastic world, which had lengthy maintained its own regular routines of formality, washing, and regulated hygiene, also experienced shifts. By means of the later center, a long time, many monasteries had turned out to be wealthy associations, normally criticized for extra and complacency. In some places, self-discipline in concerns of cleanliness comfortable, while in others, reform actions sought to restore older patterns of monastic order. But the broader effect of monastic hygiene, with its stability, regularity, and symbolic depth, lingered quietly in cultural reminiscence. In rural areas, where exchange came more slowly, older practices remained intact well into the early ultramodern period. Water used to be nonetheless fetched. Ash cleaning soap was nonetheless made. Hair was nonetheless combed with picket instruments. These habits were not outdated. They had been with no trouble ongoing, practiced no longer, out of resistance to alter. However, considering that they persevered to fulfill daily needs, the seasons nonetheless ruled when individuals bathed, what they wore, and how they managed their confined assets. In medicine, theories of the four humors nonetheless held sway, however have been increasingly puzzled. Humanists and physicians, drawing from ancient texts and new translations, started to compare the physique with renewed curiosity. Dissections, as soon as rare, became extra normal in some universities. Observations about disease and contagion extended. Specifically, after habitual epidemics, cleanliness used to be more and more associated no longer simply with moral discipline, however with the prevention of ailment, a refined but big shift. Yet it's most important to fully grasp that the folks of the late Middle Ages didn't instantly abandon their earlier the habits of washing, of soaking material, of fixing linen, of brushing hair, of making use of water slowly and carefully. These remained. What modified was the which means assigned to these moves. Cleanliness used to be no longer visible, simplest as ritual purity or private discipline, but also as an expression of social order, civility, and ultimately, scientific prudence. Through the flip of the 16th century, Europe stood on the threshold of the early contemporary age. The Renaissance used to be gathering momentum. Reformation would soon shake devout traditions. New lands have been being discovered, and new ideas were taking root. Hygiene, like language, meals, and notion, would proceed to conform, but its medieval roots, gradual, grounded, modest, would now not be forgotten. They'd be absorbed, modified, and carried ahead in methods that have been on the whole disregarded, however enduring. And so, as we conclude this lengthy and soft reflection on cleanliness within the core ages, we see no longer a world of dirt and lack of understanding, as is in many instances imagined, but an international of routine and rhythm, a global where water was once valued, where fabric was reused, the place hands have been washed, not as soon as but frequently, slowly, carefully, with the manner on hand. There was no universal system, no steady frequency, but there used to be effort, there used to be intention, and there was once continuity. The physique used to be not unnoticed. It was tended imperfectly, however faithfully, one basin at a time, one comb by means of the hair, one piece of linen hung out to dry under a quiet, turning sky. Cleanliness, in the medieval world, was neither obsession nor afterthought. It used to be without problems, a part of lifestyles lived not rapidly, however slowly, lived no longer, loudly, however gently, a everyday gesture, a quiet act, a tender sign of care. Let this be the final word in our gradual walk via this forgotten world of hygiene, a global of ash soap, wooden tubs, bloodless water, heat fabric, and a consistent feel that even the smallest routines carried, which means, even if carried out without witness or praise,